Hello, hello. We are here with another Fireside Chat from Codurance. I'm Sandro Mancuso. I'm here with Mash and José and for another conversation. So today we picked a topic that is called, Are Architects Needed? Yeah, so guys, do we need architects for anything?
No, and case closed. It was a short
Okay, that's another episode. Then thank you very much for watching.
Right. So we were actually talking about why I asked the question, right? And often there is an opinion within the developer community that architects are sometimes a nuisance, right? So that's why we're asking the question. Like, it's almost like that kind of typical view of an architect who isn't really involved in doing any of the development or any of the implementation work, but they are setting all the rules in terms of what technologies to use, what components, what microservices we're gonna have, all those kind of things. And often it becomes like you have to adhere to those rules even when they are causing problems. And if there's a problem there with any of those decisions, they're not the ones taking the pains from it, and so they don't have that feedback loop, and they're not they don't care if it's a problem or even when they do care, it's very difficult to change their decisions, or the decision change process is not good. So often there is a conflict if there are roles or specific roles of an architect in and outside development teams, that there is a conflict between developers and architects. And that's why we are framing the question in that way.
Yeah, I think this is one of those things that, where the metaphor of software as construction, or as engineering in the more traditional sense kind of breaks down a little bit, because when you are writing software, a lot of the time you're having to make certain decisions, and there are things that you cannot foresee, and you need to adapt in that sense. So trying to export something from one field into another and having all of the responsibility on the design or the architecture of the applications or the system fall on a few people, right? That then their role is to make it really clear what needs to be built, and then they won't have to intervene, and people will just be able to execute that flawlessly, right? I feel it starts breaking down, and in many ways, because again, it's a very complex thing, and that degree of being able to anticipate certain challenges or being able to resolve certain challenges is not there, right? So I feel like architecture is needed, that planning and that maybe design of is needed, but I do have a conflict with thinking that is something that only a few people can do or know how to do. I feel like that's something that needs to be part of the skill set of anyone helping to build the system. So what do you think?
So I like the idea of, I think in similar ways, for example, architecture is, for me, it's almost like management as well. Architecture is essential. If you're building anything that is meaningful, you need to architect. If you need the role of an architect, it's like management is the same thing. You need to manage whatever you are doing. If you need a role, a specific person being the manager is a different question. But then for me, so you mentioned, Jose, a few things like, for example, we need to make some decisions up front and stuff. I think that this is a very difficult question to answer without context. Yeah. So for example, what I probably would like to ask is, what is architecture in the first place? So how do we see architecture? And then, given what we see architecture at different levels, what does it need to be done like upfront, for example. And then there is a question of who does that, right? So maybe you could potentially explore that before, so just to gain more context.
I have the way I like to think of architecture. At what point it's design, and at what point it's architecture, and at what point it's an implementation, and it's a continuum. The definition that I like the most is that architecture are decisions that are difficult to change once they are made, right? So you are trying to get things right in the first place, because once you've made that decision, it will be very difficult to turn back on it, or very expensive to turn back on it.
Mash, can you expand on what do you classify as difficult to change? Where is that boundary of, yeah?
So that's a very interesting question, because while I was saying that, decisions that are difficult to change, it's almost depends on the kind of design techniques, the organization, the boundaries in the system, the dependencies, and all those kind of things. So in other words, it's very contextual dependent, right? In some cases, I would say a decision that's difficult to change is there are two teams or departments working separately on something, and they agree on a contract, right? They agree on a boundary of responsibilities that lie in one area versus the other area, and they go ahead and start developing those responsibilities. Those can then can get quite difficult to change later on, right? Or even like a persistence model, because like if you're using relational versus document databases, I'm talking more about technology, may not be as difficult to change, but could be quite difficult to change later on, because if the design of your internal systems relies heavily on what the underlying technology offers, then that could be difficult to change. Choosing a front-end technology like React versus Angular versus something else, that could be difficult to change later on, because you're building a lot of functionality, assuming a particular feature set that the framework is providing.
So I agree, but there is one level even higher than this. So one is, for example, analyzing what is the system, what are the operational requirements that currently, before we used to say non-functional, now I think that the term that we are using more is like operational requirements
or cross-functional.
Or cross-functional requirements, because people, when they say, oh, it's a non-functional, then it was automatically deprioritized, right? Yeah. So let's call it cross-functional operational requirements. So this is for me very important, because this is when you start aligning your architecture to the business. So for example, you start understanding how many transactions you're going to have per period of time, what is our throughput, what degrees of security. So when we understand how many users you're going to have, and so when you start thinking about those kind of things, we will need to create an architecture to support that. So there is an alignment of the architecture strategy to the business strategy. So what is expected from the system in terms of its usability, right? That is one level that is quite high up. And this is a level that is very difficult for to get it right by a developer in the middle of a sprint or planning the next sprint. So this is something that you really need to think carefully up front with loads of meetings and stuff. There is other aspects like observability, like monitoring the systems in production, all this kind of stuff. The system needs to be designed in order to make it observability easier. Mm-hmm. So that's another aspect to it, right? So, and then there is all the technology stack, as you were saying. So just to conclude, for example, if you want to use certain technologies, and I'm not only talking about like the cloud providers, AWS, Azure, or even a framework, like commodities as well. Let's say that you need to integrate with a third party thing. So that there are contracts involved. There is money exchanging hands. See what I'm saying? So this is also quite a very big architectural decision.
Yeah. The other things that comes to mind is if the paradigm that you're following within. So, for example, you may have you may take like an event-driven or asynchronous or event sourcing type approach. You may take a much more more traditional approach. Those kind of things can classify as architecture as well, because they're determining how the different services or components or even systems are talking to each other. Could be considered part of the architectural concerns, right? There is actually sorry, go on.
No, go on.
There is actually an even bigger thing. Like nowadays, when we are talking about much larger systems cooperating with each other, in like retail, for example, you talk about these omni-channel experiences, and they are talking about these smart hubs that bring all these separate systems together and try to create like single view of the customer and a much more seamless experience for the customer. Those kind of things can also be considered architectural concerns, because they involve so many different silos or departments kind of talking to each other, where systems could be developed in very different ways. And how you bring those together could also be considered architecture. Right?
Yeah, there are also other reasons for some decisions up front. Parallelizing work across teams.
Mm-hmm.
And some organizations, they have multiple teams in the same department, but they might have multiple departments and stuff. We work from organizations that are small, just have like a few tens of developers, to organizations that have hundreds or close to 1,000 developers in multiple departments across the world. So there is a need to understand, first of all, how do we parallelize work? How do we avoid work to be duplicated? Right. So how, for example, if you want to optimize for continuous deployment, you need to design the system for that, because you cannot have hundreds of developers trying to integrate everything that they do in a single place and then try to release multiple times a day. That's not going to happen. So even the modularization is structured so that you can optimize for parallelization of work and continuous deployment. Architecture is quite vital, and this is not something that you do on let's plan the next sprint and you come up with this stuff.
So
right?
So what within that context then, what do you think is the role of an architect? And also there's another aspect here, which is, yes, it may not be something that, because of the constraints in time, it's not something that you can decide to change, within a sprint, like you're saying, but how much of that actually needs to be either the responsibility of one or two people, or a group, versus being something that is the responsibility of the teams that are building, right? Because that's also another point. So what do you think? Yeah, what's the role then?
Do you want to go first, Mash? Or?
Yeah, I can. Actually, we can start by defining the different kind of architecture that you find in the wild, right? So there are three very typical ones. You get the solution architect, you get enterprise architect, and you get technical architect. And I probably have missed one or two others, right? And so I'll just qualify what I mean. So solution architects are often, you get AWS solution architects, right? So they understand the services quite well. They understand how the designers of those services have meant them to be used and how they are meant to be combined in different ways. So they know certain solutions, as in generic solutions, and they know how to combine them. And they know what the pitfalls are. So they may have experts that are database experts in this case as well, right? Then you get the enterprise ones.
Sorry, Mesh, would you classify, just while you are in the solution space, would you classify someone that is not potentially expert on a technology side, but like, for example, let's say there is an e-commerce application. So there is someone that is specialized in e-commerce or on the payment and gateways and fraud detection. So is a solution more as a holistic view, not necessarily technology, right?
I think that's a yes. That's a very good point. Yes, those would also come under that. The definitions vary, but this is just talking about more typical definitions of it, right? And then the enterprise architect is the kind of thing that I was mentioning earlier. You've got various departments and companies even and third parties involved, and they understand the responsibilities of each department, each area, how information should flow between them, the contracts that may happen between them. So they're almost kind of have a wider view of the organization and of the, let's say, the value stream not at the software change level, but at the product level, if all the systems create a single product. And they know how different parts of the organization cooperate with each other, and in the same way how the systems should cooperate with each other. So that's how I see enterprise architects. And then you have the technical architect, which is typically someone who is closer to the development team, sometimes even inside the development teams, who actually are taking all these, taking various options in terms of, we mentioned like event sourcing, and we mentioned they do even have expertise in understanding certain technologies and so on. They may be doing proof of concepts, and they're creating the initial organization and helping the development teams break new ground, right? And setting technical guidance and those kind of things. So they're more often referred to as technical architects, right?
That's probably more where the conflict is, isn't it? I think that the solutions and enterprise are, because they are a bit more detached from the teams. They work, even for me, like the solutions, given the definition you gave, the solutions and the enterprise architects, they work far closer to the business than closer to the developers. Mm-hmm. And they have a much macro view, their strategy is far in a higher level of abstraction. They are not very worried too much about like how you're going to organize your Java code or React code or whatever that is and stuff like that. So they are thinking about their building blocks tend to be systems, right? So, or services or high level technology and stuff like that, right? So the technical architecture is where things get a bit more blurred because they are closer normally. They tend to be. And I think that's where the how can I say, the frustration comes from developers. And I can quickly try to report, like I think that I even wrote about, of experiences. For example, I felt very frustrated to have the architects coming from outside my team and try to dictate what I had to do, or me and my team, and I would be really pissed off, right? So, but there are levels of abstraction. So I was very frustrated, but I also, there were two situations that were almost opposite to each other. One was I was really upset about certain things, and I was reporting that I was working with Mashooq for the investment bank, and we had a CTO group, and the CTO group was where the main architects were, and I was and they were pushing us to do certain things that I could not understand well. But my world was 5 systems. They were very large systems, but I looked after like Mesh as well. In our department, we had 5 systems, large systems, but 5. So I had, my world were those 5 systems, and my problems were within those 5 systems. So in one of the conversations that I had with one of the chief architects or whatever he was, he had, I remember until today, he had Visio open on his screen. And he said, okay, almost like saying, come here, son, let me show something. So he zoomed in and said, like, can you see these 5 systems? This is where you sit. And then he starts zooming out, non-stop. I said, what the fuck is it? And it's like, there were like 700 systems across the entire investment bank. 700. There were 160 front office systems capturing trades. There were 27 consolidation systems or whatever that were, because they were acquiring different banks across the world and stuff. So then I finally understood how small my problems were in that context. So that is one side of the story. The other side of the story was also that they were pushing stuff for us to do as a team, but they didn't care about our backlog. And that's the frustration from most developers come from, including mine. Because they would come in with a lot of requirements for us to fulfill that they decided in meetings that I was not part of. And they would say, hey, your team will need to comply to those things in here by X date. And I said, like, well, how do you want me to do that? We have deadlines. I already spoke to my product owners, my sponsors. We have other deadlines and stuff. If we add all of that kind of stuff, we are going to delay and so on and so forth. Now, I don't care. You need to be compliant. Otherwise, this is not approved. You cannot deploy your system and all this kind of nonsense. So this kind of detachment, this kind of dysfunction in the organization was really annoyed us, because we had no control of those changes. And quite often it was left to us to resolve the conflicts of interest between the architecture group and the actual business sponsors. And we were the ones who had to handle that. And back then I didn't have neither the seniority nor the authority to actually say, you know what, you both go to the same room, you decide what the priorities are, and then we'll do it. You see what I'm saying? But I think there is a conflict of those two views, us not having the full understanding, but also people from outside not really caring about everything else you need to do on top of the compliance that they are asking for.
So in this case, it's almost like the role that this person was performing is actually a very important role, because what they are looking at, it's not necessarily, in a way, it is enterprise architecture, because what they are looking at is how the business processes of the whole business map onto the technology, and where the waste is, and where things should be consolidated, and where the boundaries should lie, and all those kind of things. And they're thinking of those things. But the failure in this particular case is to not articulate those early enough for it to form part of the initial conversation, so that those constraints become the part of the cross-functional requirements, right? And actually the problem occurs when these edicts come in a more ad hoc manner, right? So there is the lack of planning in that sense, right? Or the plan was always there, but it wasn't communicated well, right? So there is a dysfunction. So it doesn't directly speak that this, initial question our architects needed. Well, in this case, definitely needed, because who else is going to be thinking about those, right? You can't expect the team that is responsible for 5 systems to then start thinking about the 170 other systems and have a plan for all that, and or do it by committee when the departments are not that close to each other in terms of communication, right? So that role is needed. But in this particular case, it's about communication and it's about forward planning, right? What do you think, Jose?
No, I was thinking that that is a very common dysfunction, so to speak. I would say that even when it is communicated, a lot of the times the why, or the reason why, is also not communicated. So a lot of times it's just shown as, just do this, right? Why? Compliance, whatever, because I said so. Huh? And that is that aspect, that I feel is always creates that friction, in the problem. Because if I can understand why it's being asked, then it makes it more palatable, even if I didn't participate in that process, right? But at the same time, there is an aspect there of not caring, right? Like that silo mentality. Before, when you were saying, it is to us, it falls to us to sort of like bring those two together and lock them in the same room, and that is the matrix organization for you. Right? Like you have functions, and you have the projects, and that dual chain of needs, let's call it,
Yeah.
And having to resolve that at the lowest level is one of the the main pitfalls, right? And that is very, very common in organizations of all sizes when they're trying to implement something like this, right? And there's an aspect there around understanding what those functions are trying to do and what is. But before, you were saying, like, he brought me over and showed me, started to zoom out, and then I could see the big picture. Is it your role to really have the whole picture? Not really, but that is part of what they would need to be communicating as well.
Yeah.
Right?
So just on that, like, I don't think that it was my role to certainly. I didn't even have. I think this is an important thing to mention is when we are in our world with the systems that we are working with, because we work with them on a daily basis, we know their problems inside out, and we feel that we are capable of resolving them and stuff. But when someone shows where your stuff fits, I think it is very important to put things into perspective, because then you start understanding that the big problems that you have are quite small problems compared to organizational problems, depending on the kind of organization you are and where you are in the organization. But this helps you to understand certain needs and decisions.
And I agree, but that's empathy, no? But still, you're looking from where he's standing, not from where you're standing. And you're always looking from where you're standing, is what I'm trying to say. So your problems still need to get solved, right? And this is where another major part that I feel is as often a dysfunction comes in, right? Which is closing that loop, right? And having the skills also to close that loop, right? So when I'm finding something that doesn't fit or has issues or that was planned to be done certain way, and you find that is not feasible, then what, right? Do we push through? Do we, how does that get feedback into wherever the decision came from? And lots of organizations don't have that either, right? They have the centralized, overview and all that stuff, but the way back, on how to make that better or how to evolve on top of that. And I feel it's an oversimplification to think that only a handful of people will be able to know every detail, come up with the best solution for an organization of 10,000 people.
Sure.
So that's another aspect, right? So you have one way, which is how it gets communicated down, and then the other way around, right? Like how do you close the loop or feedback into where the decisions are being made?
There is a skill to this as well, because when you said, like, sometimes there's almost like an authority chip on the architects, because they're considered normally to be at a higher level than the mere developers and the development teams, right? And certain decisions that get made, when you find the inevitable caveats in there, the things that don't work in that perfect picture of those diagrams, right? And even when feedback is given that those things are not working, it's very difficult. It's always very difficult for the development teams to go and say, actually, this thing is not working. We need to change this, or we need a slightly different decision in this particular area. Now, that might not go well with their roadmaps and their plans. Decommission X technology in favor of Y, right? So now it suddenly doesn't go with that lovely little plan. So what they do is they say, well, and I've had this, like, the decision is made. Why are you questioning the decision?
Just
it was
execute.
made 6 months ago.
Exactly.
But there is a lack of skill on the architect's part in this case, because initially when we talked about architecture, and we said, well, architecture is about making decisions that are difficult to change. Part of those that is to minimize the number of decisions that cannot be changed, right? And to provide flexibility in the way that you are dictating certain things, to know that things may not be exactly as you have seen them, and to provide that room for maneuvering when it's not the way you assumed it is.
I love that.
Yeah, like as you were saying, and I was almost complimenting. Because like a different way of putting what you said is like architecture. Also, one of the reasons for architecture, and this is true for design in general, is to make change easy, right? So that's a different way of saying that. But I was thinking that at the beginning, I was saying that there is more to it even, right? So that is to make change easy, and this is one of the core things about software design and architecture in general. But there is the strategic aspect in terms of reducing cost or improving efficiencies in different areas. So there are when people choose, for example, I'm going to use a cloud solution instead of a data center, and so it's not only making change easier. That is actually a strategic decision in order either to save costs or to improve operational efficiency, and so on and so forth, right? So there are other reasons for architecture. But going back to the topic, I find it when we ask the question, are architects needed? Normally, this question is asked by developers, right? So not many other people question the architects. It's mostly the developers, because
it would be weird. It would be weird if you had architects. No, we're questioning.
Yeah,
we really need to be here. Like, why aren't we?
No, but what I was saying, like very different. It's difficult to have different roles questioning the role of the architect, but developers normally question because it steps on their toes quite often. I find it easier, the enterprise architecture and solutions architect, and also I don't want you to have the impression that the enterprise and solutions architects are only needed in those humongous organizations. Like even in much smaller organizations, there is still a need to understand which technology should use, how we're going to improve efficiencies and save costs, and so on and so forth. So at a much lower level, even with very, very few teams, you still have that kind of expertise on the solution, on the more strategic event, and align the technology to the business.
You just hit the nail on the head, because what I was going to say, do you need architects or do you need alignment around architecture? And this is the one of the things, right? Because what those people are providing is you have someone looking at the overall picture and making sure that is aligned and it is fulfilling the needs of the whole kind of system, right? Whether they do that better or worse, or if there are communication problems or whatever. But that is sort of what the purpose is, right? So could you achieve that without having a specific role? This is the architect and this is the the person in the hierarchy that will tell you how things need to be implemented, or are there other ways?
If you ask me this question, if you had asked me this question like many years ago, I would say, of course, we don't need the architect, because I felt that as a developer, I could do all of that. And so it took me many years that my view of architecture was always much closer to the code and closer to the things that I was doing. And I didn't have a big appreciation for the actual business problems that we were trying to achieve as a whole department, let's say, or a whole IT department, not only like my department, but so I didn't have that appreciation. And most of the time, I didn't even want that responsibility. I want to say, tell me what we need to build, and I want to have some fun building that, right? So for me, the notion of architect was far closer to, according to how Mesh described them, much closer to a technical architect in terms of how we are going to structure our code or the front end and back end and the database and the transaction model or whatever else. But I had little appreciation for concerns outside my team or my immediate department. So how we're gonna make people more efficient or save costs or whatever else, everything I mentioned before. So for me, like those other two architects are clear cut. The technical one, I had an issue with but then I also changed my mind over time. Before this was the last one for me. I agree that we needed the enterprise and the solutions, even in smaller organizations. But as soon as they get too close to how we build things on the internals of my systems, that's where the clash starts. That is where the technical one is. But I think over time I changed my mind as well. So in general, I think that developers with architecture skills could do that up to a level. I think that once you start having multiple teams and multiple concerns, we felt that, for example, this thing about having developers full-time working one stream of work and trying to have decisions that would impact all the streams, I find that it's great in practice, it's great in theory, but looking back in my experience, I haven't seen that working well in practice, like these committees and stuff.
Yeah, we tried it as well, right? And it didn't work so great. Primarily because every team has a very strong bias towards their problems, right? And this is something that you find, and we can talk about organizational alignment, and you can talk about single purpose and so on. They are, of course, in an ideal situation, if there was a single purpose and overall organizational alignment and those kind of things, then so we are in particular, just to be clear with the audience as well, we are talking about architecture or technical committee, right? Where decision making is decentralized and there is a process to bring out these decisions and to create common ways of working on common decisions that impact multiple teams, right? And this is, of course, one is the problem with the bias, as I mentioned. The other is the problem with the skill set as well, because thinking at that macro level is not necessarily a skill set that you have in development teams, or even if there was, it's actually atrophied to some level because people are actually more concerned with their area and not thinking about the holistic, right? The other problem with this kind of thing is that organizing a decentralized committee like this, now this is not a community of practice, right? This is a body for decision making, and if you don't have some kind of tiebreaker authority in there, some kind of person responsible for making sure that it happens, person responsible for making sure that the decisions are aligned with each other, that one doesn't conflict with the other, and so on. If you don't have all that, these committees don't work so well. But then if you have all that, then you have centralized authority and you're back to a technical architect. so the decision making process could go into as a committee, but there is a need for ownership, basically.
I would argue that yes, you end up with a centralized, group of people that are making those decisions. The difference that I see there is that in some cases, that group of people is composed of all of the different areas that actually could close the loop, right? And this is an important part, because when you just have people who are, this idea of the architect going to the, it's the white tower, and then coming down with the UML diagrams and
the ivory
exactly the ivory
Tower.
tower kind of thing. That's what you think of, and the problem with that is not that it's one person. The problem with that is isolated from reality. Yeah, and this is where I feel like some of these other approaches, although not perfect, they are trying to solve the problem of closing that loop, right? Mm-hmm. And they're trying to do it in a way that maybe it's too idealistic or too democratic or too right. It's like everything. No, you also need the skill set to accompany. You can make decisions, but you want people who have the right skill set to be making the decisions, right? So that is where some of these things fail. No, when it gets democratized, if you want, no, but you don't have the right level of knowledge in order to make sure that the outcome is the best outcome. And this is where things like that fail. No? And I completely agree with that. But there is value in what they're trying to do, right? Like the whole idea of getting that input back into the planning or architecting of the system, and then adapting on top of that. And this is where things like requests for comments and all these kind of practices around making sure that a change that is coming out can be reviewed by people who are going to be affected and can be evolved and so on before it gets pushed as okay, this is what we're going to implement. I feel there is value in that, even if if the people driving that change are still just a reduced group. No, I feel like the major dysfunction is the disconnect, no, between reality of what needs to be built and the plan. No?
There is a disconnect, but just to be clear that I understood what you're saying, are you saying that this smaller group that is trying to close the loop, are they a group on their own? This is their full-time responsibility, or this group, even small group, is composed by members of other groups? Just to be clear over that I understood what you're saying.
I feel like there's a hybrid kind of thing. There are people who are full-time, and there are people who are there to provide the information that is specific to system and so on, and they may not be required all the time. This is the part, but they are part of representing the needs of other parts of the organization. They are parts of that decision-making process, although you may have a core group that's only focused on that, right?
Mm-hmm. There is another key element actually to having these groups, or even single person, is that often there is a lot of innovation ideas needed in creating the right approach, the right technical architecture, and evolving it, looking at new approaches, new technologies, all those kind of things. And if it all comes from one person or a small group, it's not, you're gonna have a kind of a tunnel vision to some level. And providing a mechanism for innovation to come through all the teams, and for it to, in certain ways, for it to be as free as possible, so that if you constrain things with too many processes, too many it can stifle innovation. But also having some kind of checks and balances in there, whether that's guidelines or principles that everyone's agreed to, or a kind of a process for submitting innovative solutions. You need to kind of provide that ways of standardizing as well, so things are not just turning into chaos where every single problem is kind of reinvented, or solution to every single problem is reinvented, basically.
I agree, and you touch on another point that's very important, because in order to scale and not to have like that centralized thing where every decision needs to go through a group of people, and then of course we know what happens now, things get slower and so on, right? That combination between certain decisions going through there, or certain let's call it planning or forward kind of looking, is happening within the group. But there are guidelines. There are certain guides that people can use in order to continue adding and solving their local problems within certain constraints. That allows that flexibility. So a combination of both, having that, let's call it governance, that overall where things are going, what are the main tenets of how we're building this thing or how this should work, and then having a localized set of principles or tenets that people locally can use to solve their issues within those constraints. I feel like that's a very powerful combination in itself. No, what do you think?
No, I think that we are just like I would agree with that, but I think we are conflating two things in here. From what I understood, because I myself also agree that I don't like the idea of democratic decisions for very important decisions. So everything that is very important, I don't think it should be democratic, right? So I think that it should be a very group of people, a few group of people that have that responsibility. They have the skills. They were chosen by senior management.
That's democracy, Sandro.
No, because
you're talking about referendums.
So they were chosen by the senior management to say, like, look, I'm going to hire a few people with certain skills or promote some people in the organization with certain skills and stuff. And those people have the skills. The organization recognized those people as the ones with the right skills to make certain decisions, right? So, but then what we are talking about is how this group of people, this small group of people, can behave or work in a way where they don't stifle creativity or they don't become the center of the universe. So, but for me, it's slightly different. So I still like the idea of having well-defined responsibilities in different levels of abstractions. So you know who the decision group is, but the group, and then as a device to the group, in order to be very efficient and have a healthy organization, they can come up with those, call it governance or call it other ways, so that other people in the organization can be involved in that topic. Like in this case, we're discussing architecture, and provide so that, but this group is the group creating the framework. Is still the one creating the boundaries and the ways that people could contribute to wider decisions. See what I'm saying? Because maybe just a very minor point, because I've seen some bad examples of course, we talk about the bad examples when you have a single person making decisions and destroying an organization from a single place, right? So making tens, if not hundreds of people extremely unhappy or full departments going extremely inefficient.
And wasting
right?
millions. Yeah,
wasting millions with those 5-year crazy plans and all this kind of nonsense, right? So we talk about that, but we rarely talk about the other extreme. At least twice in our history as a company, we had people coming to us, people that were hired to take over a department and say, look, I don't even know what I have. So basically it was a hippie festival where every single team could do whatever the hell they wanted. And they had systems that they didn't even know about in tons of different technologies. Every team could do whatever. And of course, as in a normal company, people come and go, right? Some people join the company, they stay there 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, they do a lot of things and then move on. And another person with different opinions. So basically, like, we had different organizations, quite significant size organizations, where they had no clue what they had. Mm-hmm. They have no idea.
But this brings us very back to the values and principles that Jose was talking about, right? Because, architecture team or architect or whichever, they are a form of leadership, right? And we talked about the why of certain decisions as well, right? When we are making certain decisions, but not communicating the why, and actually articulating certain values and principles, the base which are forming the basis of these decisions, and in a way nurturing the organization to adopt those principles helps you, one, when you are making decisions as architects, whether it's a group or body or whatever, for people to naturally understand the why, but also for them to be natural allies in your decision making, because you can be making many decisions at the high level, but they might be following the rule of the law and not the spirit, and you will still fail. So it's essential that these principles, these ways of working, these kind of and the high level plans, the objectives of the architecture group, those are well articulated, and the rest of the teams buy into them, right?
Yes. Do you think that for me, like when I was as I was evolving in my career, it took me a long time to understand that the architecture skills, I think you were touching on that, Mash, are different. They are not the same skills that you have as a developer. And I think that the more you start thinking about architecture, the closer to the business you become. Because the problem is, I think, going back to the technical architects, I think this is the issue that I always had, is because a lot of decisions are still very technical. We need to do microservices, or we want to use this kind of technology, that technology. And that is, of course, that decision needs to be made. Of course, we need to agree which architectural style or pattern we're going to use, or which technology. We need to define the detail at some point. But what I think that the skills is like identify which business problem you're trying to solve, and then match that technical implementation to solve it. So that gap, that jump from being a guy that focuses on the code, on the nitty-gritty of the code, on my tests and stuff, to, okay, what are the business inefficiencies, even if they are technical problems? Like being able to say, like, a technical problem is a business problem, and do that.
Yeah, risks. Yeah, risks. Right? Normally, any technical change is related to risks, cost, or yes, a business
and
advantage.
the change should be to address a business need, and that could be an inefficiency in the technical in the ways of working, right? So I think that this jump, it took me years to understand that I didn't have those skills, that I didn't even care about those problems. I just didn't want someone to step on my turf and say, like, I didn't want someone to come in and tell me what to do. But I also had very little appreciation to the problems that they were trying to solve, or maybe they also didn't articulate them. But even if they had articulated them in the past, knowing me as I was, I probably didn't want to hear either, right? So, because I was still focused on the technical side.
Yeah, no, there is definitely an element of that as well, right? It's almost a necessity for when you're starting off development. I think, Jose, you were talking about, JB Rainsberger's comment that, junior developers, 80% of the book are about APIs, and senior developer, 80% of the book are about amateur psychology, So yes, we, as developers, when we are starting out, there is almost like an obsession, which is needed in developing those skills. They are difficult to attain, and there's a lot of detail and and variation, and learning all those. And then on top of that, learning all the kind of organizational aspect is very difficult. And sometimes you are, starting out, and when you have teams that are more junior and so on, it's difficult to teach those skills and show them that kind of perspective. Doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, like that's why it's good to have teams that have a good mix of seniority and that kind of thing, that can have that perspective as well. And there comes the other thing, right? From an individual perspective, of course, there are individuals who may not see the problem in those contexts, but others in the team may see it. And having this kind of team level view is important as well, that they are teaching these and nurturing these people as well, but of course articulating from a architectural, from a leadership point of view, making sure that the team values the things that you value, they are working with the same kind of principles that you are working with, is actually very important for an architect as well. And almost more important, it's not important for them to say use this technology or do this, but say, well, use these principles to make your decisions, right? And they will automatically come to similar or even better solutions. But of course, there is also a need to make sure that there is no chaos, right? So I think that, ultimately what Jose was talking about as well is that the problem isn't with these people making decisions at that level. The dysfunction normally arises from the fact that there is lack of feedback loop and flexibility in their decisions and plans to take that feedback on and evolve, right?
I just want you to flip that a bit, because I'm conscious of time. So is an architect the next step for a developer, or is a completely different set of skills? So how do you see that?
That's an excellent question.
It's the same question. Is like a manager the next step for a developer.
Exactly.
Right?
So the manager, I had a clear answer to that in the past. What I was thinking is, like, when you become a manager, you are almost changing ladders. I don't think that is a natural evolution for a developer. I think that you might have gone quite far in one area, and you now have enough skills, if you want to, not as a natural progression of the ladder that you are in, but also you might want to now experiment other skills, other types of roles that you can benefit from the experience that you built. But it's almost like you are changing ladders in a way, and there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. But I don't see a natural continuity. But with the architect, it's a bit more blurred. So that's why I want to pop the question and so
maybe. I don't know, Jose. I think you'll probably have a much better answer to this, but let me kind of try to answer. I personally don't see the manager that much different. I see, like, even as a developer, you need a lot of management skills, and you specialize in them, and you move into that kind of specialization. And, as you go into one area of specialization and go deeper, you lose other areas, and that's natural too. And same with the architecture as well, because making decisions, thinking about things at another level or a different level means that you are specializing in certain areas, and you will probably lose other areas. Now, is it a natural progression for a developer? Depends what the developer wants as well, because nowadays there is enough opportunities in the industry that you can take any specialization. You can take a development level specialization, technology, language, paradigm, and similarly, you can take a specialization as an architect as well. It's what you want to do, and it's how you want to progress. That may provide more opportunities in the context that you're in. You may want to make more money. You may want to have more decision-making power at a different level. So I think, to me, it's. I don't think it's a natural progression. I think it's a specialization. Jose, what do you think?
I'm pretty aligned with that. I feel like it won't hurt you to have those skills. Yeah. So even if what you really like is, you want to be down with the code and, pushing features out and that kind of stuff, having that knowledge of how everything fits together and, what are the different, let's say, patterns that you can use and so on, will automatically kind of make you a better at what you're doing, right? So going down that route or exploring in that area or acquiring that skill set is something that I would recommend to anyone. Whether moving to an architect position is the right thing for you, that really depends, I feel, on the organization. Because if you are, it's a bit like the Peter principle, no? Like you go up in the hierarchy all the way until you reach your highest level of incompetence.
Incompetence,
yeah. So while depending on the organization, like moving to something like that may remove you from that reality, of what it is to push out the feature, and that maybe is not what you want. You know what I mean? Like we've had conversations with people, for instance, who moved into more of a management position or architect position, and they're like, "Oh, I need to go back and like really, freshen up on this stuff, and I would really love to like sit down and write some code, and if that's going to be you, maybe that's not." Ideal for you. Maybe there are other ways in which you can earn more money or whatever without having to move into one of those positions. But it's really dependent on the company, because there are also really good architects who are, very close to reality, and then that allows them to make better decisions when they're structuring systems and so on, right? So it really depends on the organization where you're going to be, taking that step. And the other thing is, I will question why it is that you're doing it, right? Is it out of, as you were saying, I want to earn more money, or want to have more decision-making power, or curiosity, right? Like I want to be exposed to this kinds of problems that I'm normally not exposed to, and I want to, right? And if the driver is, money or power, I will question that, right? To some extent. But yeah, I don't think it's inherently bad. It's just, very context dependent, on what you want to do.
Yeah, I have a maybe slightly different view. So I think that for people that want to remain very technical, mainly, well, let me specify that. For people that want to remain closer to the code, I think that it is very good for their career progression to acquire knowledge within the technical architecture in terms of architectural patterns, some different types of technologies and things like that. So within the given Mash's definition at the beginning, so for me, incorporating technical architecture skills into your skill set is extremely important for your career progression. And then you can, depend on the organization, those skills will easily give you team lead positions and stuff like that. And also you should be invited. It will be easier for you to be in certain meetings and influence decisions and even making some decisions at that sphere. However, if you want to go to a solutions architect or enterprise architect, for me, that is a much bigger gap, because that is quite far away from the code. You really specialize in the solutions architect, for example, you specialize in either in a type of technology, as Mash was describing, like a cloud or some products or whatever, or you define in a specific type of system. So then the nature of your work is significantly different from what you were doing before. And the enterprise, the same thing. So the enterprise architect, for me, you use a lot of high-level concepts in terms of technical knowledge, but your work is far more business-focused than actually technically focused in a way. For me, so for me, they are the solutions, and the enterprise is almost a separate career that you can go to. I don't think there is a natural progression, because you don't need to go there to progress. You can keep going on the technical, remaining closer to the delivery, the development and delivery of the software. If you go to those ones, you are kind of now pushing a specialization that moves you away from what you've done.
Going
There's
into
a bigger distance from
PowerPoint-driven development.
Huh?
Going into PowerPoint-driven development. No?
Exactly. Exactly. Your best tool is PowerPoint, visual, and diagrams, and so
there's
on.
There's a bigger distance from technology. If you're a developer, you do have those skills, management, architecture, all those you're building. That's why I refer to it as a specialization, both of them. But yes, you make a good point that, especially being a technical architect, you are still closer to development than you would be as an enterprise architect, or as a solution architect, not so much, because you would still be closer to development.
Yeah. So, so in terms of final words, do we need architects?
Well, the answer is yes. After an hour, you do, but they need to be. There are many dysfunctions to do with that role that you need to be careful about.
Yeah. And then you need to make sure that you're putting in place the right mechanisms to avoid them, and to make sure that you're getting what you need, basically.
Mm-hmm. But you don't need an architect if you got a small team with a small system, right?
I think this is why I think that context is really, really important.
Yeah.
Here, right. So you are in a small company and stuff. You don't need tons of formal roles and stuff like your feedback loop. I think that going back to what you were saying, Jose, probably that's an interesting way to talk about this. Is the number of people and the feedback loop among them is much tighter. So you probably don't need that big role. However, you need architectural skills. Even if you are in a tiny company with 2 developers, you need architectural skills. You still need to think about your production environment, your deployment, your process, your technology choices, cost, efficiency, security, all of that stuff.
And right? that's a universal. Whether you have architects or not, you as a developer need architectural skills.
Exactly. And I think that then, depending on the size and the structure of the organization, then certain specializations on the architecture might be more important, and even how those teams or developers collaborate to make architectural decisions, and in which level, because as we were discussing, there are multiple levels of architectural decisions. And I think that the higher up we go, the smaller and less democratic the group should be. I think that if you this is my view, because like, for example, you don't go to your, I'll give an example because I don't want you to be misinterpreted. So I don't want you to be misinterpreted. But for example, I think that it would be an extremely bad idea for you to have a poll across tens of developers to decide which cloud provider to use, or which third party to integrate, or which product to buy. So I think that would be a very bad idea to do that. That this is where I was coming from. So very expensive, strategic decisions should not be decided democratically, but like which testing framework you want to do, right? Which library or JavaScript library to do across the system. So then it can be democratic across the teams, and they could reach an agreement. This is what I was trying to say. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Are we done?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, so as always, if you like this chat, thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, but most importantly, if there is a topic that you would like us to discuss, leave a comment and we'll do our best to address that. Till next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.